The sun was a merciless hammer beating the life from the cracked earth. For Ilara, it had become a personal tormentor, chasing her across the arid expanse, leaching the moisture from her body until her tongue was a swollen, useless thing in her mouth and her vision swam in shimmering waves of heat. Her people had cast her out. To be barren was to be a ghost in the longhouse, a vessel that could not be filled, and so they had sent her into the wilderness to become a real one. She had walked until the soles of her moccasins had worn through, then she had crawled. Now, she did not move at all, only lay beneath the meager shade of a skeletal mesquite, waiting for the buzzards she could hear circling high above. They were patient. She was done. Her world had shrunk to the rasp of her own breathing and the blinding white of the salt flats that stretched to the horizon. This was the end, a quiet, undignified fading under an indifferent sky. Despair was a cold stone in her gut, a final companion in the furnace of the desert. Her thoughts, once a river of memories and grief, had slowed to a stagnant pool of sensation, the grit of sand against her cheek, the burn of the sun on her back, the low, mournful cry of the wind. A sound, not of the wind or the birds, fractured the stillness. It was the rhythmic crunch of boots on stone and the soft snort of a horse. Ilara did not have the strength to lift her head. Let the end come. Perhaps it was a spirit, come to guide her across the final threshold. But the sound grew closer, more solid, more real. A shadow fell over her, a sudden, shocking relief from the relentless sun. She felt a presence, a stillness that was not her own. Through cracked eyelids, she saw the shape of a man, tall and broad, silhouetted against the blinding sky. He knelt, his movement slow, deliberate. She could smell dust and leather and something else, the faint, clean scent of soap. It was a smell of a world she had lost. He said nothing, simply uncorked a canteen. He didn't try to lift her head. Instead, he dipped a corner of a rough-spun cloth into the water and gently, carefully, touched it to her lips. The moisture was a miracle, a shock of life that was almost painful. She drank weakly, the cool liquid a benediction on her parched throat. He pulled the cloth away, dipped it again, and bathed her face, his touch surprisingly gentle for hands that were calloused and scarred. His face was weathered, carved by the same sun and wind that had nearly destroyed her, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a profound and weary quiet. He was a white man, a settler. One of the ones her people traded with but never trusted. Yet there was no judgment in his gaze, only a deep, unsettling pity that made her feel her own wretchedness even more keenly. He had found her, a discarded thing, and in his silence, she felt the full weight of her shame. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his arms strong and sure around her skeletal frame. The world tilted and spun, a nauseating blur of brown earth and blue sky. The horse, a sturdy sorrel, shifted its weight but stood steady as he mounted, settling her in front of him. The motion of the horse was a gentle rocking, a cradle carrying her away from her own grave. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her head lolling against the solid wall of his chest. Each time she surfaced, she was aware of the steady beat of his heart against her ear, a rhythm of life that seemed to pull her back from the edge. They traveled for what felt like an eternity, the landscape slowly changing from barren flats to sparse, hardy grassland dotted with juniper. Finally, a structure rose from the heat haze, a small, solid cabin built of rough-hewn logs, a curl of smoke whispering from its stone chimney. It looked lonely, an island of human effort in an ocean of wilderness. This was his home. He carried her inside, into a cool dimness that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. He laid her on a simple cot, the straw-stuffed mattress a luxury beyond imagining. For a time, she knew only fevered dreams, haunted images of her village, of disapproving faces, of the long walk into nothingness. Through it all, a quiet presence moved in the shadows. Broth was spooned into her mouth. A cool cloth soothed her brow. He moved with an economy of motion, wasting no effort, speaking no words. He was a man accustomed to solitude, his silence as much a part of the house as the stone hearth. On the third day, the fever broke. She woke to clarity and a profound weakness. He was sitting at a small table, mending a piece of leather tack, his head bent to his work. He looked up, his grey eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, she saw the deep lines of exhaustion around them. He had saved her life. This simple, undeniable fact sat between them, heavy and complicated. As if summoned by her return to the world of the living, a new sound reached them, the hoofbeats of several horses. Silas, she had heard him murmur his own name once in the long nights, rose and went to the door, his body tense. Ilara pushed herself up on one elbow, her heart pounding. Through the open doorway, she saw them. 5 men from her tribe, led by the elder, Cale. Their faces were grim, their bearing rigid. They had not come for her. They had come for him. Cale's eyes, ancient and sharp, bypassed Silas and found her on the cot. A flicker of something, disapproval, perhaps regret, crossed his face before it settled back into a stony mask. He spoke, not to her, but to the white man who had interfered with her fate. His voice was low, resonant, each word in her native tongue dropping into the silence like a stone into a well. "You have taken this woman from the spirits who had claimed her," Cale said, his gaze unwavering. "She was cast out by the law of our people. By touching her, by bringing her to your home, you have tied your spirit to her broken one. She cannot return to us. She cannot remain here as she is. It is forbidden." Silas stood his ground, his face unreadable. He did not understand the words, but he understood the gravity. He looked from the elder to Ilara, a question in his eyes. She translated, her voice a dry whisper. "He says, you have made me your responsibility. In the eyes of my people, by saving me, you have chosen me." A cold dread washed over her. She knew what was coming. It was the old law, the law of balance. Cale's next words confirmed it. "To restore honor, to mend what has been broken, you will take her as your wife. Today. Before this sun sets." The silence that followed Cale's pronouncement was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Silas stared at the elder, then his gaze shifted to Ilara, searching her face for confirmation, for some sign that this was a misunderstanding. But her expression, a mixture of shock and resigned horror, told him everything. The demand was real. It was not a negotiation. It was an edict delivered from a world with rules he did not comprehend. His life was one of solitude, a deliberate construction of quiet labor and managed loneliness. He had inherited this ranch from his father, and for 15 years, he had worked it alone. His wife, Mary, had died years ago, taking with her their unborn child and any hope for the legacy his father had dreamed of. The doctor had told him then, in hushed, apologetic tones, that there would be no more children. He was barren, a dead end, a fact he had carried like a stone in his soul. He had made his peace with it, or so he thought, channeling his life into the rhythms of the land, the cattle, the turning of the seasons. Now, this. A wife, commanded. A stranger, broken and exiled, delivered to his door by fate, and a moment of compassion he was beginning to regret. He looked at her, truly looked at her. The sharp angles of her face, the dark, haunted eyes, the way she clutched the rough blanket as if it were the only solid thing in her world. Taking her in was one thing. A duty. An act of mercy. But marriage? It was a profanity, a mockery of the life he had shared with Mary, a union of two solitudes that promised only more silence, more emptiness. Yet, he understood the grim logic in the elder's eyes. He had seen the way the men looked at her, not with hatred, but with the cold finality of a judgment passed. By interfering, he had made her an anomaly. She belonged nowhere. Returning her to them was impossible. Leaving her here, unmarried, would make her a pariah in his world as well, a savage woman living with a white man. The town of redemption, a hard-scrabble collection of pious and suspicious folk, would crucify them both with whispers and stares. The elder's solution, as harsh as it was a kind of protection. It gave her a place, a name, his name. It created a fragile shield of legitimacy around them both. He looked at Cale, whose face remained impassive, and gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made. There was no joy in it, no ceremony in the true sense. Cale stepped into the cabin, the others remaining outside as witnesses. He spoke a few words in his language, a short, solemn verse about the joining of two paths into one. He took Ilara's hand, her fingers small and cold in his, and placed it in Silas's rough palm. He looked at Silas and said in broken, halting English, "You protect. She is yours now," and that was all. They were married. The tribesmen mounted their horses and rode away without a backward glance, disappearing into the vast landscape as silently as they had appeared. The dust settled. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before, thick with the weight of what had just happened. They stood in the middle of the small cabin, a man and a woman who were now husband and wife, more estranged than any two strangers passing on a trail. Ilara would not meet his eyes. She stared at the floorboards, her shoulders slumped. He saw a tremor run through her. She was a prisoner, bound to her rescuer by a law she could not escape. And he, Silas, was her jailer. He turned away, unable to bear the accusation in her posture, and moved to the hearth, poking the embers with more force than was necessary. The single room felt impossibly small, charged with unspoken fear and resentment. He was a rancher, a man of simple, tangible things, mending fences, birthing calves, reading the sky for rain. He had no idea how to navigate this. He had saved her from the desert, only to trap her in a cage of his own making. The first days of their marriage were a pantomime of cohabitation, a careful choreography of avoidance. They moved around the small cabin like wary animals, each acutely aware of the other's presence but refusing to acknowledge it. The silence was a physical entity, a third person in the room. It filled the spaces between the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the creak of a floorboard, the sigh of the wind through the eaves. For Ilara, the cabin was a cage, albeit a comfortable one. After the horrors of the desert, the simple cot, the regular meals of stew and hard bread he left for her were a profound luxury. But they were the provisions of a captor, not a husband. She ate when he was outside, her movements furtive and quick. She watched him from the single window, a tall, lonely figure moving with relentless purpose against the vast backdrop of the plains. He mended fences, tended to his small herd of cattle, chopped wood, his actions forming a steady, predictable rhythm that governed their lives. He was a man etched by grief. She could see it in the way he stood, in the stark lines of his face when he thought no one was watching. She saw him once, standing by a small, unmarked wooden cross on a hill behind the cabin, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. He stayed there for a long time, a statue of sorrow, and she felt a pang of something other than fear, a flicker of understanding. He, too, was an exile of a kind. Silas, for his part, was lost. He had lived with silence for years, but this was a different kind. It was an accusatory silence, freighted with her fear and his guilt. He would leave food on the table and retreat outside, giving her the illusion of privacy. At night, he slept on a bedroll by the cold hearth, leaving her the cot. It was a chasm of unspoken words and unmet gazes. He would talk to his horse more than he talked to her, the soft murmurs to the animal a release from the suffocating quiet of the house. He tried once. "The stew is warm," he had said, his voice rusty from disuse. She had flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders, and given a small, jerky nod without looking up. The attempt died there. He retreated back into himself, focusing on the familiar solace of hard labor. He found himself noticing small things about her. The way her hands, though thin, moved with deftness. The way she would listen to the sounds of the night, her head cocked, her expression one of intense focus, as if reading a language he didn't know. He saw the strength returning to her, a slow, quiet unfurling. One morning, he came inside to find she had swept the floor with a makeshift broom of twigs. Another day, he found one of his ripped shirts laid on his cot, the tear stitched with neat, precise stitches, the thread pulled from the hem of her own worn dress. They were tiny offerings, cracks in the wall of silence. He acknowledged them with a nod in her general direction, a gesture she never returned. He didn't know her name. It seemed too great a trespass to ask. To him, she was simply the woman, a constant, silent reminder of the day his life had irrevocably fractured. The loneliness he had thought he had mastered had returned with a vengeance, sharper and more acute now that he was no longer truly alone. Weeks bled into a month. The raw edges of their arrangement began to smooth, not into comfort, but into a predictable routine. Ilara's physical strength returned, and with it, a sliver of her spirit. The cabin, once a cage, was now simply her world. She began to venture outside, first only to the woodpile, then further, into the small garden of hardy vegetables he kept behind the house. She recognized some of the wild herbs growing at the edges of the tilled soil, plants her grandmother had taught her to use for healing and seasoning. One afternoon, she watched as Silas struggled to corner a calf that had taken ill, its breathing shallow and ragged. It was the dust lung, a sickness she knew well. Without thinking, she walked to the creek bed, her eyes scanning the foliage. She returned with a handful of silver-leafed sage and another bitter root. She crushed them with a stone, her movements sure and practiced. Silas watched her, his expression a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He had been about to put the animal out of its misery. "Wait," she said, her voice soft but firm. It was the first word she had spoken to him directly. He froze, startled by the sound. She knelt by the calf, forcing the pulpy mixture into its mouth, stroking its neck until it swallowed. She brewed the remaining leaves into a strong tea and showed him how to make the calf drink. For 2 days, they took turns, a silent, shared vigil. On the third morning, the calf was standing, shaky but alive, breathing clearly. Silas stood beside her, looking at the recovering animal. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes was different. The pity was gone. The guilt was still there, but it was joined by something new, respect. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a treaty. "My name is Ilara," she replied, her voice still quiet, but steady. "Silas," he answered, as if introducing himself for the first time. The exchange hung in the air, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their silence. That evening, for the first time, they ate at the same table. The silence remained, but its character had changed. It was no longer a weapon or a wall, but a space that held the potential for something more. A few days later, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind tore at the small cabin, and rain lashed against the windows. Silas was out, checking on the herd, trying to drive them into the small, sheltered canyon nearby. Ilara watched from the doorway, her hands clenched. She knew these storms. They could turn the dry creek bed into a raging torrent in minutes. She saw him, a distant figure on his horse, fighting against the wind. Remembering the path she had seen him take, she realized he would try to cross the creek on his way back. She pulled on his spare oilskin coat, which swallowed her whole, and ran out into the deluge. The wind stole her breath, but she pushed on, her knowledge of the land guiding her. She reached the creek just as it was beginning to swell, a muddy, churning serpent. She found him further up, urging his horse toward the crossing. "No," she screamed over the roar of the wind and water. "This way! The high ground!" He saw her then, a small, frantic figure waving from a ridge he rarely used. He hesitated for a moment, then turned his horse, trusting her. They made it back to the cabin soaked and shivering, but safe. Inside, as the storm raged, he built up the fire. He handed her a dry blanket, his fingers brushing hers. It was a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through her. They had saved each other now. The scales were balanced. The fragile piece of their shared existence was shattered by the arrival of a buggy, sleek and black against the muted landscape. A man in a tailored city coat and bowler hat climbed down, his movements precise and proprietary. This was Jedediah Thorn, a name Silas had spoken once with a quiet bitterness. Thorn owned the mercantile in Redemption and held the deeds to half the county, his ambition as vast and rapacious as the land itself. His eyes, small and shrewd, swept over the modest ranch with a dismissive air before landing on Ilara as she stood in the doorway. A flicker of contempt crossed his face, a look she had seen 1,000 times. To him, she was not a person, but an object, a curiosity, and a flaw in the man he had come to see. "Silas," Thorn said, his voice smooth but with an undercurrent of steel. "I see you've acquired company." He didn't wait for an introduction. His gaze dismissed her as he turned his full attention to Silas. "I'm here to repeat my offer. This plot is too much for one man. It's barely profitable. Sell it to me. I'll give you a fair price. You can move to town, live comfortably." Silas's face was a stone mask. "The answer is the same as before, Thorn. This land was my father's. It's not for sale." Thorn's smile was thin, unpleasant. His gaze slid back to Ilara. "A man needs a family to build a legacy, Silas. A proper family. Not this." The insult was deliberate, a poisoned dart aimed not just at her, but at the very heart of Silas's private grief. He was reminding Silas of his childlessness, of his failure, while simultaneously branding Ilara as an unacceptable substitute. Ilara felt a cold fury rise within her, but she held her ground, her expression unreadable. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She was a daughter of the plains, not some wilting town flower. She had survived exile and death. She would survive the venom of this small, cruel man. Silas took a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of her. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but to Ilara, it was a wall. "She is my wife," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "And this is our home. You're not welcome here. Leave." Thorn's eyes narrowed. The pretense of civility dropped away, revealing the ugliness beneath. "You're a fool, Silas. A lonely fool hiding in the dirt with a savage. This land will be mine." One way or another he climbed back into his buggy and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and ill will. The confrontation left a poison in the air. That night, the silence in the cabin returned, but it was charged with a new tension. Ilara saw the weight of Thorn's words settle on Silas. He was not just a solitary rancher anymore, he was a man with a vulnerability, and she was that vulnerability. The town of redemption, which he had kept at a careful distance, now felt like a looming threat. She knew what they would be saying. The whispers in the mercantile, the judgment in the church pews. The lonely widower, Silas Blackwood, had taken a native woman, an outcast, into his home. They would see it as a sign of weakness, of madness. She felt a fierce, protective urge rise within her. This man, this stranger husband, had shown her a quiet decency she had never expected. He had defended her. Now, she understood that to stay here, to make this place her own, she had to be more than just a mended shirt or a swept floor. She had to be a partner. She had to prove that she was not a liability, but a strength he didn't even know he had. The wild, untamed land that had almost killed her was the one thing she knew better than any of them. It was her language, her inheritance. And she would use it to defend their home. In the days that followed Thorn's visit, a subtle shift occurred. The unspoken treaty between them deepened into a quiet alliance. Silas, seeing the new resolve in Ilara's eyes, began to cede a space for her in his world that went beyond the four walls of the cabin. He started talking to her, not just in necessities, but in observations. "Sky looks like it'll hold," he'd murmur, and she would nod, adding, "The nighthawks are flying low." Rain by evening he began to listen. He watched as she identified plants he'd always considered weeds, explaining their uses. This one, a poultice for burns. That one, a bitter tea for fever. This root, when dried and pounded, could be ground into a passable flour. Her knowledge was a quiet power, a deep-rooted wisdom that his plows and fences could never replicate. He taught her his world in return. He showed her how to properly milk their one cow, his large, rough hands guiding hers with surprising patience. He taught her the names of his cattle, the history of his branding iron, the story of the father who had staked everything on this piece of unforgiving land. He spoke of Mary once, his voice soft, his gaze distant. She would have liked the flowers you planted by the door. It was a bridge to his past, an acknowledgement that Ilara was not replacing a memory, but creating a new reality alongside it. Ilara, in turn, began to see the man beneath the stoic exterior. She saw the weariness in his shoulders at the end of a long day, the flicker of pride in his eyes when he looked over his herd, the profound loneliness that clung to him like dust. His infertility, the secret shame that Thorn had so cruelly wielded, was something she understood in her own way. She, too, was barren, cast out for what her body could not do. They were two sides of the same coin, marked by absences, defined by what they lacked in the eyes of their worlds. This shared wound, unspoken between them, forged a bond stronger than any ceremony. The town's hostility became more palpable. When Silas rode in for supplies, the mercantile owner, a man beholden to Thorn, served him with a cold curtness. Old acquaintances averted their eyes. Whispers followed him down the dusty main street. He returned to the ranch each time with his jaw set a little tighter, the lines around his eyes a little deeper. He never told Elara what was said, but she could read it on his face. She saw the cost of his choice, of her presence. It fueled her determination. She began to walk the boundaries of the property daily, not as a prisoner surveying her cage, but as a guardian learning her territory. She memorized the game trails, the hidden springs, the treacherous patches of rock and thorn. She knew the land's moods, its secrets, its dangers. One evening, she found tracks near the northern fence line. Two men, on foot, their trail deliberately obscured. They had been watching the cabin. She showed Silas, pointing out the subtle signs he had missed. "Thorns men," he said, his voice grim. The threat was no longer a matter of insults and offers, it was drawing closer. That night, as they sat by the fire, the silence was comfortable, a shared understanding. "I am not afraid," she said quietly, looking into the flames. He looked at her, truly seeing the strength that had bloomed from the ashes of her despair. "Neither am I," he replied. And in that moment, they ceased to be a man and a woman forced together by circumstance. They were a partnership, forged in silence and sealed in shared defiance. They were home, and they would defend it together. The first overt act of aggression came a week later. Silas awoke to a strange smell on the wind, acrid and wrong. He found his small haystack, their entire winter feed for the cow and horse, smoldering into a pile of black ash. There was no doubt who was responsible. It was a message, a warning of escalating intent. The loss was a hard blow, but as they stood looking at the ruin, Elara felt a cold calm settle over her. This was a language she understood. It was a declaration of war. "They will come for the water next," she said, her voice certain. Their well was their lifeblood, the only reliable source for miles. Sabotaging it would be a strategic and devastating move. "They think we are weak," she continued, her dark eyes meeting his. "They think you are one man, and I am nothing. We will show them they are wronged." Her certainty was infectious. It banked the fires of Silas's anger into a focused, hardened resolve. They spent the next 2 days preparing, not waiting to be victims, but setting the stage for a confrontation on their own terms. Following Elara's direction, Silas dug a shallow trench, diverting a small, almost unnoticeable trickle from the spring that fed the well. He guided it through a series of rocks and gullies to a low-lying, marshy area thick with thorny scrub and hidden sinkholes, a place he usually avoided. It was a natural trap. Elara, meanwhile, gathered piles of dry tumbleweeds and resinous branches, placing them at key points along the ridge overlooking the main trail to the cabin. Their vigil began. They took turns watching through the night, the rifle resting against the wall, the silence of the cabin now a coiled spring of anticipation. On the third night, under the sliver of a waning moon, they came. For figures on horseback, moving slowly, cautiously, toward the well. Elara saw them first, a flicker of movement against the starlit horizon. She touched Silas's shoulder. No words were needed. They moved to their positions with practiced quiet. Thorns men were clumsy, city men playing at being frontiersmen. They dismounted near the well, their voices low and coarse as they discussed how best to foul the water. This was the moment. From his position behind a rocky outcrop, Silas fired a single shot into the air, away from them. The crack of the rifle echoed through the canyon, sending a panicked flock of birds into the sky. The men swore, startled, grabbing for their own weapons and fumbling in the darkness. As they scrambled for cover, Elara, hidden on the ridge above, lit the first of her signal fires. The tumbleweed caught with a whoosh, erupting into a sudden, terrifying ball of light, casting long, dancing shadows. The men, blinded and confused, saw what looked like a dozen figures moving in the demonic light. They panicked. Their first instinct was to flee, not back up the open trail, but into the darkness on the far side of the well, exactly where Ilara and Silas had wanted them to go. They ran straight into the marshy ground. The lead man's horse screamed as its leg plunged into a hidden sinkhole. Another man stumbled into the thorny scrub, his clothes tearing, his skin ripping. They were caught, floundering in the mud and thorns, their bravado stripped away, replaced by terrified cries in the dark. From the shadows, Silas's voice boomed out, magnified by the terrain. "This is my land. Get off it and do not return." He fired another shot, this time kicking up dirt near the feet of one of the trapped men. It was enough. They abandoned their injured horse, clawing their way back onto solid ground, and fled into the night, a disorganized, terrified rout. The silence that descended was profound. The signal fire burned down to glowing embers, the smell of smoke and fear lingering on the air. Silas walked back toward the cabin, his rifle held loosely in his hand. Ilara met him at the door. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes bright with a fierce, triumphant light. They had not shed blood. They had not engaged in a pitched battle. They had used the land itself as their weapon, her knowledge and his resolve acting as one. They had outthought their enemy, not just outfought them. He looked at her, this woman he had found dying in the desert, this stranger who had become his wife, his partner, his defender. A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile she had ever seen. It transformed his weary features, erasing years of solitude and grief. "I believe," he said, his voice laced with a humor and warmth she had never heard before, "that you are a far greater liability than Thorn ever imagined." She smiled back, a true, brilliant smile of her own. The war was not over, but this battle was theirs. And for the first time, under the vast, starry sky, the lonely cabin truly felt like a home they had built together. In the quiet aftermath, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The acrid smell of burnt tumbleweed faded, replaced by the clean, cool scent of the high desert night. They did not speak of Thorn or his men. The victory hung between them, a shared and solid thing. Inside the cabin, Silas added a log to the fire, the flames leaping up to paint the room in flickering shades of gold and orange. He turned and looked at Ilara, who was standing by the hearth, her silhouette framed by the warm light. The woman he had found was gone, replaced by this one, whose eyes held not the emptiness of despair, but the deep, steady glow of a fire well tended. The fear that had lived between them for so long had been burned away in the night's confrontation, leaving a space clean and new. He crossed the small room and stood before her. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently tucking a stray strand of black hair behind her ear. It was the first time he had touched her with simple, unalloyed tenderness. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement that spoke volumes. The years of his own barren solitude, and the weeks of hers, seemed to dissolve in that single, quiet gesture. He had saved her body from the desert, but tonight, working together, they had saved each other's souls from the wilderness of loneliness. They had been forged into a unit, a tribe of two, bound not by a sterile law dictated by others, but by the fire they had walked through side by side. The world outside, with its harsh judgments and greedy men, still existed. Thorn would likely not give up so easily. The town of redemption would still whisper. But none of it seemed to matter as much within the circle of light cast by their hearth. They had found their own center, their own law. The home was no longer just his, and her life was no longer just a debt to be repaid. It was theirs. She looked around the simple cabin, at the rifle mounted over the door, the neatly stitched tear in his shirt, the small pot of herbs she kept on the windowsill. Each object was a verse in the story of their becoming. Her gaze returned to his face, to the stormy grey eyes that no longer held pity, but a deep and abiding respect that mirrored her own. Her past as an outcast and his as a widower were not erased, but they were no longer the defining features of their lives. They were simply part of the landscape they had crossed to find each other. He had been a man convinced his line ended with him, that his life was a fallow field. She was a woman told she was an empty vessel, a curse upon her people. But together, they had cultivated something new and unexpected. Not a family of blood, but one of spirit and resilience. She was no longer dying, and he was no longer alone. As the fire crackled, casting their two shadows on the wall until they merged into one, Elara knew she was finally, truly, home. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, she felt not fear, but a quiet, unshakable hope. They would face the dawn together.